By the time I turned onto her street, the rain had started up again. That soft, relentless Vancouver kind that doesn't bother announcing itself. Cecily was asleep in the passenger's seat, not the peaceful kind. The kind where your body just surrenders mid-sentence and you tip sideways against the window with your mascara halfway down your face and one earring missing. I'd found the earring on the floor of the bar when I went back for her jacket. I put it in my coat pocket and didn't mention it. I'd known Cecily Wren for 4 years. We met at a mutual friend's going-away party in Gastown, which is to say we both showed up for someone we barely knew and ended up talking for 3 hours in a corner while the actual party happened around us. She'd just moved back from Montreal. I'd just quit a job I was too embarrassed to defend. We were both, in different ways, starting over, and there was something clarifying about meeting someone in that state. No performance, no positioning. Just two people being honest, because they were too tired not to be. Since then, she'd become the kind of person who exists in all the small architecture of your day. She was who I texted when something annoyed me. The one I called when I needed someone to tell me if I was being reasonable or unreasonable and trusted to be accurate either way. She knew which coffee I ordered at which shop and why the flat white from the place on Main Street, the drip from the cart outside the library, never anything with caramel, because she had correctly identified that as a personality flaw. I knew her too. The way she tucked her chin down when she was about to say something that embarrassed her. How she went very, very still when she was angry, the way ice goes still before it breaks. How she laughed louder at her own jokes when she was nervous. Tonight, she hadn't laughed much at all. The evening had started fine. Cecily's colleague Margot was getting married in the spring, and this was the engagement dinner. A private room at a restaurant in Yaletown, good food, people who all seemed to work in the same industry and refer to it like it was a war. They'd all survive together. Cecily had asked me to come because, in her words, she needed someone in her corner who was allowed to find things funny. I wore a jacket. She wore a dark blue dress that made me need a second to reset my face before we went inside. 2 hours in, Owen showed up. Owen worked in the same office as Cecily. She'd mentioned him a handful of times over the past few months. Not constantly, but in the careful, distributed way people mention something they're trying not to emphasize. She said he was smart. She said he was funny. She said he had a habit of making everyone in a room feel like they were the most interesting person in it, and that she'd eventually figured out it was technique, not sincerity. But by that point, it had already done its work. He came in with a woman named Brooke, who was introduced as his girlfriend with the kind of easy, casual confidence that makes it immediately clear the relationship has been going on for a while and is not a surprise to anyone except maybe you. Cecily smiled when they were introduced. The smile was perfect. I'd seen her use it before, and I'd always thought it was admirable. That ability to arrange your face into something that costs nothing when something is actually costing you everything. She accepted a glass of wine and turned back to the conversation, like Owen had just been another name at a dinner she'd forget by Monday. Then she accepted a second glass, and then a third. By the time we got our coats, she was still walking straight, but only because she'd decided that was her job for the evening, and she was going to do it professionally. I got her to my car without incident. She told me twice that she was fine. I said okay both times without arguing, because that's not the kind of argument worth having at 11 p.m. in a Yaletown parkade. She was asleep before we hit the bridge. Cecily still lived at home. This was not unusual in Vancouver, in your late 20s. The rental market had made living alone something between a luxury and a punchline, and she'd been saving for years while waiting for the right moment to move out. Her parents had a house in East Van, the kind of neighborhood that had changed so many times. In the last 20 years, it had stopped trying to explain itself. I'd been there dozens of times. Her dad had once spent 45 minutes teaching me how to properly cut a mango. Her mom, Helen, made tea the way other people made arguments. Thorough, specific, not interested in shortcuts. I pulled into the driveway just after midnight. The porch light was already on. I got Cecily out of the car carefully. She leaned into me, one hand finding the lapel of my jacket, the other hanging loose. Her shoes were still on, which I counted as a win. I walked her up the front steps slowly, one hand on her back, and the door opened before I could knock. Helen Wren was standing in the doorway in a cardigan, and that particular expression mothers get when they've been awake waiting and have decided to be kind about it anyway. She looked at her daughter first, the assessment that mothers do in about a quarter of a second, and sighed. Then her eyes moved to me, and then she stepped closer. Close enough that her voice wouldn't carry. "You know," she said quietly, almost like she was thinking out loud, and I happened to be there. "She talks about you constantly." I stopped. I don't think it showed, but I felt it. That full-body pause that happens when something hits you somewhere you weren't guarding. Helen's expression didn't change. She just held my gaze for a moment, steady and a little tired, like a woman who had been holding on to a thing she wasn't sure she was supposed to say and had finally decided the shelf life on keeping it had run out. "I probably shouldn't have said that," she added. "No, I swallowed. "It's okay. I'm just not sure what to do with it." Cecily made a small sound against my shoulder and muttered something that wasn't a word. "Can you help me get her upstairs?" Helen asked. "She'll sleep better in her own bed than on the couch." "Yeah, of course." The stairs felt strange to walk up. I'd been up them 100 times, to grab a book she'd lent me, to help move a dresser, once to sit on the floor of her room at 2 in the afternoon while she stress-organized her closet, and I read to her from a thriller she'd declared too anxious making to read alone. I knew the seventh step creaked. I knew the hall light switch was lower than you expected. But tonight everything felt like it had been placed slightly differently. Not the house. Me. We got Cecily to her room. She sat on the edge of the bed and blinked up at me like the light was a decision she hadn't made yet. "Hey," she said. "Hey, did we leave?" "About an hour ago." She processed this. "Good." She looked up at me, and there was that thing that happens when someone is too tired or too unguarded to do the normal work of being themselves. That stripped-down version that's somehow more them than the everyday version, not less. "I'm sorry," she said. "Not about anything specific, just in general. Don't be I wasn't." She stopped. Restarted. "I knew he was with someone. I think I knew. I just kept not knowing, because it was easier. I didn't say anything to that because there wasn't anything to say that wasn't obvious, and obvious wasn't what she needed." "He didn't even look guilty," she said. "He just introduced her, like it was nothing, because to him it probably was." She was quiet for a moment. "That's actually worse." "I know." Helen came in then with water and 2 Advil and gave me a look over Cecily's head that was impossible to read entirely, but contained, somewhere in it, gratitude. "I'll get her settled," she said. "You don't have to stay. He can have tea," Cecily said, not quite to either of us. Helen looked at me. "You can have tea," she confirmed as though that settled it. So 20 minutes later, I was in the Wren kitchen with Helen across from me and rain on the windows, and Cecily asleep upstairs. And the whole evening had somehow shifted into something I didn't have a word for yet. Helen set a mug in front of me and sat down with her own. She didn't preamble. She was not, in my experience, a person who preambled. "She's been in love with you for over a year," she said. I looked up. Helen looked back, not uncomfortable, not apologetic, just steady. "I'm not saying that to create a situation," she added. "I'm saying it because she came home from your birthday in October and cried for 20 minutes and told me she didn't know what to do with herself, and I've been sitting on it ever since." My birthday in October. We'd all gone to a pub in Kitsilano. It had been a good night, as far as I knew. I'd thought she'd seemed quieter than usual on the drive home, but I'd assumed it was just tiredness. "I didn't know," I said. "I know you didn't. That's rather the problem." She wrapped both hands around her mug. "She's very good at looking like she's fine with things she isn't fine with." That landed with more precision than she could have known. "She's going to wake up tomorrow," Helen continued, "and she's going to remember enough to be mortified. And she's going to spend the next week being very breezy and very funny and making sure you both pretend tonight was just a long evening and too much wine. Unless someone stops her." Helen looked at me for a moment. "Unless someone stops her," she agreed. She took a slow sip of tea. "I'm not asking you to do anything tonight. She's not in a state, and you're decent enough not to use that. But I am asking, do you mean this? Because if you don't, let her rebuild the wall. She's good at it. She'll manage." A pause. "But if you do." "I do," I said. And then, because that had come out too fast to be polite, "I mean, I'm not just saying that because of what you told me. I'm saying it because I've been trying not to say it for a long time, and it turns out that gets exhausting." Helen was quiet for a moment. Something in her face shifted, not dramatically, just the way a room shifts when someone opens a window and the air moves. How long? She asked. I thought about it honestly. Longer than I knew it was happening, I said. I thought it was just. She's important to me. People can be important. That doesn't have to mean anything. And then one day, I was driving home from her place after a completely normal Sunday, and I thought, I don't want to do a single day that doesn't have her in it, somewhere. And then I thought, oh, that's that then. Helen nodded slowly. That's what it feels like when it's real, she said. Not to me, specifically. More like to the room. We sat for a few more minutes. I told her about the earring in my pocket. Cecily's earring, the one I'd gone back for. Helen held it for a moment and then set it on the counter like a small piece of evidence. Stay in the guest room, she said when I stood up. Not because of anything, just because she should see you here in the morning. Not a text. Not later. Here, yeah, I said. Okay. The guest room was at the end of the hall, 2 doors down from Cecily's. I lay down fully dressed except for my shoes and stared at the ceiling and listened to the rain and tried to how a completely ordinary Wednesday evening had become the thing I was going to remember for the rest of my life. I thought about October, her birthday in February, when she'd shown up at my door because her plans had fallen through and I'd made her eat frozen pizza and watch a documentary about bridges, and she'd said it was the best birthday she'd had in years, and I'd thought she was just being kind. I thought about the time she'd had a brutal week, a family thing I won't get into, and I'd driven an hour and a half through a snowstorm to sit with her for 2 hours and then drive back because she hadn't asked me to stay and I hadn't known how to offer. I thought about how many times I'd watched her walk towards some version of the wrong thing and kept my mouth shut in the name of being a good friend, as though staying silent was the same as being supportive. Somewhere around 2 in the morning, I heard footsteps in the hall. Light, careful, trying not to wake anyone. They stopped outside my door. A soft knock. I was up immediately. Cecily was standing there in a gray cup sweatshirt and socks, arms crossed, hair loose, looking the way people look when they've been awake long enough to sober up, but not long enough to rebuild the armor. We looked at each other for a second. Then she said, please tell me I didn't say whatever I think I said. I didn't say thing. She closed her eyes. Okay. I definitely said it. You said a few things. That is a horrible sentence. She opened her eyes. How bad? Not bad. My mom was there for some of it. She put one hand over her face. I need you to understand that I had a plan. A very good plan. The plan was, don't. That was the whole plan. Just don't. And I have maintained that plan for a very long time, and I would like some credit for that, even if tonight was a complete. Cecily, she stopped. You didn't ruin anything, I said. She looked at me from behind her hand. Then she lowered it. Her expression was careful. The look of someone who wants very badly to believe something and is suspicious of wanting it too much. You're saying that to be kind. I'm not. You're very kind. It's one of your worst qualities. I'm not being kind right now. She searched my face. Then what are you being? I stepped into the hallway, quietly, and pulled the door most of the way closed behind me so we were just 2 people in a dark hall with the rain still going on outside the windows. I stayed, I said. I could have gone home. I stayed. Cecily looked down the hall, at the guest room door. Back at me. Something moved through her expression that she didn't try to control. Why? She said, because I knew if I left you'd wake up and convince yourself it meant nothing. And I didn't want you to be alone with that. She was quiet for a moment. That's, she started, stopped. I know. That's a very unfair thing to say to a person who is still slightly. I know. She exhaled. Not quite a laugh, not quite not one. She looked down at the floor, the old runner that went the length of the hall, then back up at me. What did my mother say to you? Downstairs? I heard you talking. I couldn't. I didn't know what, but I heard voices. She told me you talked about me. Cecily was quiet for a long moment. She promised she wouldn't do that. She also said she'd been sitting on it for a while. Yeah, that tracks. Another pause. Are you? She stopped again. This was unusual. Cecily was, in my experience, not someone who stopped mid-sentence. She reloaded and came back. Are you only saying any of this because she told you? Because I need to know the difference. No, I said. And then, because she deserved more than one syllable. I'm saying it because I drove home from your place in October. The Sunday in October, after we spent the whole day doing nothing, and somewhere on the drive I thought, This is the life I want. Not a version of it. This specific one. And I didn't know what to do with that, so I kept not doing anything, which I now understand was stupid. Cecily stared at me. That was my birthday weekend, she said. I know. You stayed and helped me build that shelf. The instructions were wrong. It took 4 hours. I cried when you left, she said. Very quietly. Not because you left. Just because, yeah, I didn't want the day to end. Me neither. The hall was very quiet, the kind of quiet that has weight. Cecily uncrossed her arms and let them fall to her sides, which for her is a significant gesture, the posture equivalent of putting something down you've been carrying. I've been comparing everyone to you, she said. Steady now, sober. Not a confession made easier by wine, just the one she'd been postponing. Every person I've tried to date in the last 2 years, at some point I've thought, he doesn't listen the way you do. He doesn't make me feel like my opinion is actually worth something. He doesn't remember what I said 3 weeks ago and bring it up when it's relevant. Her voice was even. It started feeling unfair to them because they weren't doing anything wrong, they just weren't this. Whatever this is. It's not nothing, I said. No, she said. It's not nothing. I looked at her for a second. I want to ask you out properly, I said. Not tonight. Tomorrow, when you've slept and had coffee and you're wearing something with more structural integrity than that sweatshirt. That surprised a small, real laugh out of her. The sweatshirt is from 2019, she said. It's been through a lot. I can tell. She looked at me for a moment, then she said, properly how? Dinner. An actual reservation. Not because something happened to make it necessary, just because I want to take you to dinner. On purpose. Without your colleague's engagement as the occasion. She was quiet for a second. Her expression did something complicated, and then settled into something I hadn't quite seen before. Not the smile she used when she was managing a situation. Something quieter. Something that was hers. Okay, she said. Yeah? Yeah. She looked down at the floor again. Tomorrow. She looked back up. There was something in her face that I think had been there for a long time, and we'd both been careful not to name it, and now we'd named it. And the world was still there. The rain was still going. The house was still standing, and nobody had been destroyed. She reached out and took my hand. Just like that. No ceremony. Fingers laced through mine like that was just where they went. My mom is going to be absolutely insufferable about this, she said. She's already earned it. She gave you tea, didn't she, and told me to stay in the guest room. Cecily groaned softly. She's been waiting for this. You know she has a whole thing she says. There's a shelf life on pretending. She says it about everything. The leftovers, the paint in the hallway, apparently also me. She's not wrong, she's never wrong. That's the problem. She squeezed my hand once, then let go. Okay, guest room. Sleep. Tomorrow. Tomorrow, I said. She looked at me for one more second, that same open, unguarded look, and then she was gone down the hall. I stood there for a minute after her door clicked shut. The house was quiet. The rain was quieter. Everything felt exactly the same and completely different, the way things do when the shape of something has finally been named. The next evening, I came back at 7. I'd made a reservation at a place in Commercial Drive that she'd mentioned once in passing, 6 months ago, that she'd always wanted to try. The fact that I'd remembered it and she hadn't told me to was either sweet or alarming, and I decided to let her make the call. Helen answered the door. She looked at me. She looked at Cicely, who appeared behind her pulling on a jacket, hair up, looking nervous in a way that had no performance in it at all. Then Helen looked back at me. About time, she said and stepped aside. Cecily made a sound that was approximately mom. Helen kissed her cheek. She looked at me. You know where she likes to sit in restaurants? Not by the kitchen and not facing a wall. Good. She nodded once, like something had been verified. Bring her back happy. Dinner was easy. Not the forced easy of two people trying hard. The real kind, where you realize that whatever was always between you is still there, it's just allowed to be there now. We talked for 3 hours. I told her about October. She told me about February. We argued about the documentary on bridges, which she admitted had, in fact, been exactly right for that night. She stole the last piece of bread without asking. I didn't say anything, because I'd been watching her do that for 4 years and wasn't about to ruin a perfect habit. Walking back to my car, she reached for my hand again. Still no ceremony, still no announcement, Just her fingers finding mine like that was always where they were going. 6 weeks later, not much had changed, except everything. She still called me when something frustrated her. I still drove her to things and picked her up from things. We still spent Sunday afternoons doing nothing in particular, at her place or mine. The only real difference was that now, when she fell asleep on my shoulder watching something on her laptop, neither of us pretended it was an accident. And when I drove home after, I didn't spend the drive wishing I'd said something. Helen, for the record, remained completely insufferable. She earned it. What would you have done if you drove your closest friend home on the worst night of her year and her mom pulled you aside and said the one thing that changed everything? And has there ever been someone in your life that you kept choosing around until one night you just couldn't anymore? Tell me in the comments. If this one stayed with you, leave a like and subscribe. I'll see you in the next one.